Welcome to our first panel of the day, Borough Spotlight, Brooklyn, a conversation about the specific issues that residents in Brooklyn face and potential steps to take toward an affordable, thriving future for this specific borough. Remember, attendees, you will see a chat box and a Q&A box both directly to the right of this live stream video. Use them to communicate with other attendees and to send questions for consideration by our moderator. If you're having technical difficulties, click on the red icon in the lower right corner. With that out of the way, I'm going to pass it to Rebekah to get this session started.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to not see you, but have you here with us in the virtual realm. My name is Rebekah Morris. I'm a senior program manager with the Pratt Center for Community Development. My work focuses on the intersection of housing, sustainability, and racial justice. And I'm currently working on projects that look to problem solve around how to help BIPOC and low-income households access clean energy. Very, very excited for today's conversation. We have some really great panelists with lots of experience for all of us to learn from. So I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we'll kick off what I hope to be a great conversation. I'd first like to introduce Blondell Pinnock. Blondell is the president and CEO of Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation, which is the nation's first and oldest community development corporation, and whose mission is to close the racial wealth gap in central Brooklyn's lower income neighborhoods through an economic mobility platform designed to help people become financially literate and independent. Blondell is also the first woman in Bed-Stuy's history, 55-year history, to hold this position, which is very exciting. Welcome, Blondell. Next, we're going to go to Allison Martinez. Allison Martinez is co-founder of Brooklyn Level Up, a nonprofit community development corporation that serves BIPOC existing and aspiring entrepreneurs, and through its community land trust work, helps individuals seeking affordable residential, commercial, and communal spaces in Flatbush, East Flatbush, and Flatlands. She is also a practicing startup business law attorney and licensed real estate broker. Welcome, Allison. Next, we have Richard Trouth. Richard Trouth is Executive Director of Brooklyn Neighborhood Services, a Bed-Stuy-based nonprofit focused on creating and preserving affordable housing opportunities, financial empowerment, and community leadership in central Brooklyn. Richard has over 20 years of affordable housing experience under his belt. And lastly, welcome Richard. And then lastly, we have Jacob. Jacob Faber is an associate professor of sociology and public service in New York University's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service, my alma mater. Jacob's research and teaching focuses on spatial inequality and how the distributions of people by race and class interact with political, social, and ecological systems to create and sustain economic disparities. So let's just get right into it, right? So, today we really want to examine the dynamics at play that have gotten us into the current housing crisis and where we see the biggest barriers to housing equity existing within the context of Brooklyn. We want to discuss the work of our panelists and how it relates to solving these barriers and assess where there could be opportunity to create change in the near future, and sort of where our panelists see the potential for some solutions to the many problems that we see currently. I'm going to start with a question for all of you to answer. We can start with Richard, because you are in my top right corner, or the top left corner, I should say. So, and then I would ask all of you to answer as well. So many neighborhoods, right, in Brooklyn and New York City, especially those with large immigrant and BIPOC homeowner populations, have been experiencing extreme speculation, house flipping, and harassment, right? This is destroying the affordability of these neighborhoods. It's gentrifying away many of the unique spaces that instill the diversity that makes Brooklyn such a special place to live. And it's pushing people out of the places they've called home for their whole lives. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to talk about how, this has been ongoing, obviously, for a very long time. There's a lot of talk about how since the push towards normalcy with COVID, a lot of these issues seem to be on hyperdrive, right? And so in this moment, I'd ask for you to start off by taking into account the way COVID disrupted the market and what are the most important problems facing affordable homeownership and intergenerational wealth transfer post-COVID. And then on the flip side of that, what is an innovative strategy? It could be legislative or policy or programmatic and community-based that you see as an important tool for helping to resolve these issues. Richard, would you like to take it away?
Sure, thanks, Rebekah. So I'm going to actually start with the intergenerational wealth transfer, because that's a specifically unique to our community. It's an issue that is pretty common in communities of color. It's not something that we prioritize. And what happens is when homeowners pass away and something goes wrong and the home is up for sale, everybody goes crazy, nobody planned for it, and it just becomes a big mess. And sometimes these properties end up with the city or whoever else, the builders, whatever. So one of the things that we've done, and we started this about 2.5 years ago, right after COVID set in, we were doing a lot of Zoom workshops to our homeowners, especially our seniors, because they're always targeted when it comes to flipping and deed theft and all that stuff. And one of the things that we thought we needed to prioritize was the awareness of preparing for intergenerational wealth transfer. And it's something that we've actually incorporated into our homebuyer class, our financial literacy class as well. And it's become a common thing, and we realized a lot of people never thought about that. This is, well, people live within this community. So that's something that we are definitely have hyped the awareness on, and we're pushing that. The other thing, as far as affordability on the policy side, one of the things that we'd like to continue to do more of is protect subsidies, and get our politicians to believe that that's something that's necessary. And also maintain inclusionary housing. So there's different things that we're looking at that we never brought to the forefront before, which we're doing now to try to help with the homeownership preservation plight.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, intergenerational wealth transfer is a really important issue, and I look forward to hearing how others are also working on it. Wanda, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm going to add to what Richard already discussed, because we are actually working in partnership with Richard. As you indicated, you talked about restoration in our history. Restoration was really started to be a stabilizing force in Bedford-Stuyvesant, given the unrest and given what happened in the late 60s, early 70s. And so we have always been on the ground when it comes to home ownership and when it comes to economic viability of the BIPOC community. What I think is important when we talk about the issues of home ownership and the barriers that exist, to Richard's point, this is universal within the BIPOC community. We know that there have been systemic issues that have been placed, systemic potholes that have been placed to kind of prevent home ownership throughout this country and throughout history. And despite that, people of color, Black people in particular, have been able to own a piece of the American dream and to purchase homes. I think for us as of organizations that are on the ground and in the trenches, it's not only being able to provide resources for them to gain knowledge and to gain education about what it takes to be a homeowner, but I think it's also to sustain the home ownership, which Richard talked about. I think some of the things that we have done and that we continue to do is the G2G estate planning program. And I think that's what Richard was essentially touching on. And we work with NHS on that to offer free wills, trust estates, and services to Black homeowners in Central and South Brooklyn, right? Because that's a critical thing. When you start talking about creating a trust, and you start talking about the transference of real estate from one generation to another, but it's the transfer of it, and it's really the information. And it's letting people know, because what we have found is even when you do transfer, that transfer has been done properly, there are still times when family members have lost that property for failure to pay taxes, for failure to pay water bills, for failure to pay other bills that are part of the home ownership process, even if the home does no longer has a mortgage, right? So it once again boils down to education. And I do believe that because of that, I think it's important for Restoration to continue with our Center for Personal Financial Health. And with that, we have education, homebuyer education. We have certified HUD counselors. We have one-on-one counseling after you've done that. And then we also have financial assistance in our partnerships with a lot of the banks and other lenders that we work with.
Very interesting. I have a question about this program, G2G. Is this when you are working with seniors to discuss intergenerational wealth transfer? Do you also engage their kids and their grandkids, and is it a sort of a family experience? And okay,
yeah. So the audience isn't just the grandmother and grandfather. The audience is the grandmother, grandfather, the children and grandchildren that are part of the class and part of the lessons.
Gotcha. And so that gives an opportunity to educate sort of about not just transferring, but then what you talked about, sort of here are some pitfalls once you have this house as an owner, like these are some options for you to make sure you remember your taxes, et cetera. Yeah. Excellent. Very interesting and important. I'd love to hear from Allison next, who's also working in the field, but it seems a little bit differently. So maybe you could give us some insight into what you're seeing as some of the biggest issues post-COVID.
I would say, honestly, COVID, if anything, just exacerbated what we were already seeing. And it just made it clear with the trust and estates planning that couldn't be more critical right now. Especially you had a lot of people making poor decisions in moments of grief. You had people unexpectedly dying, of course, and then the family had no real plan for how they were going to dispose of property or maintain it if that was what they wanted to do. And we also saw with the tax lien sale, we went door to door to help people fill out the COVID exemption forms. And that's where we saw on the ground, it is because of lack of knowledge about trust and estates planning that people were caught up in the surrogate's court. They had no idea about these liens, and they were basically losing these generational properties, which then meant communal loss of wealth as well. And you saw blighted properties as a result of that. I think some of the other things we notice are that people do not have any idea how to really value or determine the market value of their property. So that makes them susceptible to anyone throwing out any number. You have people who have left the area but still own property and are using property values from wherever they're currently living to think about what the New York value would be, and therefore losing basically money that's sitting on the table. Or people not realizing that even if I don't live here, that doesn't mean I have to sell. I can still use my home as a business, generate income that can then start a new business or send someone to college, all of these things that can be options. And the other thing we noticed, and this can be particularly clear in the Caribbean community, is the secrecy about what's going on with the home, thinking that if I don't tell anyone about a foreclosure that's coming, it somehow goes away and no one knows about it. Not discussing the costs. And the reality is there's nothing about a home that is private. It's all public information. And the more that people speak to one another, the more they can actually make a difference in help saving homes and saving community. And the reality is what people don't realize is that what happens to your neighbor's home affects the value of your home as well. So keeping that private and separate actually does not help. So that's what we find we need to do more of, is educating on the grounds and helping people fill out forms.
Interesting. So it sounds like all of you are saying there really needs to be a cultural shift in the way that homeowners understand and think about what the house means to them and their families and their communities. So that's very interesting. Jacob, I'd like to have you jump in and talk a little bit more about your work, right, is a little bit further out. It's like looking at the macro. And so if you're welcome to answer the question about sort of what is the biggest issue that you're seeing, but I'd love to sort of hear about your work in terms of spatial inequality. And Blondell mentioned systemic issues as being like just there and really hard to battle. And could you talk a bit about how your work sort of, one, using spatial inequality analysis unpacks how that analysis looks like? What does that look like in New York City, right? Like, what does this look like? What do we see? And how is that affecting current levels of affordability?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. And I agree with almost everything that the three panelists said before me. And just to kind of, as you mentioned, to kind of draw out a level. So I study segregation in the way that segregation exacerbates racial inequality. And one of the ways that it does that is through excluding vulnerable communities, which Blondell mentioned in the homeownership realm. People of color have been historically excluded from that opportunity for building wealth, both in the individual, family, and community levels, but also through exploitation, right? And a lot of that has also occurred through the housing market. And this is a very, I wholeheartedly agree with Allison that the pandemic, as all crises, really just accelerated or exacerbated or kind of made visible these trends that have been long in coming. Du Bois wrote about the way that segregation was used to exploit Black people. So did Baldwin. There's the exclusion piece, which is really important. Then there's the exploitation piece. We're circling back to, Rebekah, your question about real estate speculators buying up properties. This is it's a national trend, and it's really quite scary for someone who studies housing and the way that housing can be used to, again, kind of draw resources out of some communities and build resources in other communities. What we're seeing in the wake of the COVID pandemic, but even drawing it back another 15 years through the subprime and foreclosure crises. These communities that have been vulnerable because they have been excluded for generations, don't necessarily have the financial resources to weather these economic storms, and then they're easily taken advantage of due to the economic precarity that they face. We saw this with check cashing outlets popping up in the places that were hit hardest by the foreclosure crisis, and now we're seeing it with hedge funds and other real estate speculators buying up properties in communities of color.
Could you expand upon that second piece and what you're seeing in terms of, because I hear like, oh, Blackstone is buying, or something like 1/4 of all like single family homes are owned by investment vehicles. Like, I don't know. I would love to hear about like really what is statistically, like what information do we have and what information don't we have, and what policies do you see as is there a potential for sort of limiting their ability to eat up all of the properties?
Yeah, it's really a fantastic question. And I think that there's far more that we don't know than what we do. And a lot of this has to do with how the real estate industry operates. I've lived in New York for a while now and lived in, I don't know, half a dozen different apartments, and every single apartment was a separate LLC. And part of that is a way that small business owners can kind of build some financial security, but it's also a way that larger real estate firms are able to hide financial connections between investments that they've made. So, and part of the consequence of that is that it's hard to know who is buying in these neighborhoods, especially if you don't have access to very expensive proprietary data that are collected and then sold by private firms in the real estate industry. So we know there was a series of really great articles in the Washington Post about a year ago about buying these big firms buying up properties in and around Atlanta, but we only know that because they had access to the proprietary data. There's nothing on the national level that would allow us to get that kind of insight into the market. What does exist in the public domain is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, which requires mortgage lenders to collect and report information on basically every mortgage applicant in the country every single year. And you can kind of use that to proxy investor purchases of properties. But the problem with what this kind of new wave of speculation is that a lot of these companies are just buying properties with cash. So they're not even showing up in that data set that is supposed to exist so we can understand racial disparities in home buying. And so that information is lost.
Interesting. It makes me wonder if there's opportunity to compare the number of mortgages versus the number of buildings sold in a city. I don't know if that is a way to sort of research that or on the ground sort of door knocking, right, on places that have sold. I'm interested to hear from the other panelists. I mean, right, has this issue really, how does that change the dynamic? Is it different than just sort of your local developer coming around and trying to hustle to get the building off of someone's hands, because these are these large corporations? Do you see a different dynamic, or does it play out very similarly? And this is for anybody.
I think that it remains to be seen, because the incentive for a hedge fund is to basically make profit quickly. And then what happens if the model doesn't pan out? What happens to the people who are actually living in those spaces, who are then just thrust out or passed on to someone else? You have no real sense of what will happen over time. We're not seeing that directly right now, where at least on the ground, I'm seeing that more of the individual developers scooping up blocks, but it's unclear to me exactly where we go from there and how we plan for it, because it's I don't see elected officials talking about it on the local level about what to plan for. And then the other piece of that is, as we're educating people about using an LLC, even as individual people joining into the market, or we're telling people to use trust and estates planning, at the same time, when we're telling them that, we need legislation that matches so that they don't lose their tax exemptions that they can get for STAR and all of that. And they're able to maximize what's available to them to deduct or to get an exemption for without losing it as a result of learning and then taking advantage of what could be a tax savings or just an income generator for themselves.
Anybody have anything to add?
I mean, for me, and I don't want to be a history lesson, but I'm sure Jacob will support this. I mean, this just seems to be the pattern, and it seems to be cyclical, particularly within our communities. I've read recently, I was read an article called Stolen Wealth, where it really focused on Chicago and the practices that existed in Chicago, and the fact that Black families just paid more on average for home ownership in those communities because of redlining, because of predatory practices, because of all those things. And that same history repeats itself in communities of color. And these are the issues that we continue to fight on a day-to-day basis. But it's estimated, I think, in Chicago between 1950 and 1970, before the Fair Housing Act was signed, that the Black communities lost anywhere from 3.2 to 4 billion due to racist housing practices. So we know that even when we do get homes, we're paying more for the homes that we get because of predatory lending. And we saw that in the crisis in '08. And we also know that our communities have the least amount of disposable income to be able to not only purchase the homes, but maintain and stay in the homes that they have. So this is the battle that groups like Restoration and NHS and Allison's organization that we're trying to battle on a day-to-day basis. Because even when the residents in the community, they're able to rally together and they're able to put all the building blocks in place to own and to maintain, there are all these other external factors that are preventing them from being successful with home ownership and preventing the successful transfer of that ownership intergenerationally. And I don't know, and from a legislative standpoint, as Allison indicated, we're not keeping up with all these things that exist. And we've never really put the Black community and Brown community on equal footing when it's come to home ownership at the end of the day, because we were targeted by predatory lenders. They were paying more for their mortgages, even if they had stable income, even if they had good credit, they were still paying more for what everybody else has. And there was never been anything to really adjust that inequity that exists and still exists in many instances.
Sounds like one of the many things that where reparations in some sort or other for these communities, right, should be involved. I mean, I guess I'm wondering from, what do we see in the policy realm? I mean, I guess my question is for Jacob, right, you're coming from sort of this academic perspective. For everybody else, you're in the field work. Where do you see there being potential policy that strikes you as like, this actually could help solve this? If we could get this off the ground, if we could get political will, and obviously it sounds like it's a suite of things that are needed, but if there's one or two areas that seem like they could potentially be a model for solving some of this.
I think you're absolutely right to highlight reparations. It's a absolutely necessary but insufficient step towards racial equality. As Blondell kind of mentioned, this exclusion is really insidious when you think about it. Blacks in particular were excluded from mortgage lending for most of the 20th century, ostensibly because lenders said it was too risky for Blacks to take on mortgages, even though, as Blondell so rightly pointed out, Blacks have been paying more for worse housing for that entire period. And the same is true with more recent predation and subprime lending crisis. The Wall Street Journal, of all places, estimated that half of subprime borrowers should have qualified for prime loans. And my own research has found that Blacks and Latinos making $250,000 a year were more likely to get subprime loans than white borrowers making $35,000 a year. And so this is all, again, about a history of extracting wealth out of vulnerable communities and funneling it to already privileged communities. And so there's nothing without a serious consideration of a redistribution of that wealth. And again, that won't solve every problem, because we still have enormous racial and spatial inequities in education and environment and access to employment and healthcare, et cetera. But without addressing the enormous wealth inequality that is built upon this differential access to home equity accumulation, there's no way to get there.
I would add, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would add to, I think if we were to have a concerted effort to address the fact that we have appraisals that are not equitable, that are not, so if we are training people from these communities to have that skill set, that's a small business they could create that then helps to protect and deal with the fact that we're not going to overcome racial inequality, but we can actually try to at least stem the tide of it by training our own people to be able to carry out those appraisal values that will help keep equity within the community and value. Also, not punishing people who in the Black community, a lot of people there who are middle class, it's because they have pensions. People who have pensions tend to therefore are not able to qualify for some of the exemptions that exist because their income is considered too large. So allowing those limits to increase to cover that. So we're not punishing people for having a pension, which is when we far and few between as we go forward with the way that the job market is. Those are things that we can do, and supporting the community land trust, which is an opportunity for more self-determination, ownership, and networking within communities to save where they already live.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to talk about community land trust a little bit more, but also this idea of creating jobs through creating jobs for appraisers, right? So that's a really interesting idea. Like, I would love to hear sort of some other ideas that are similar to that. If pressure, like if there are other, ideas of how do we circumvent locally to create economic opportunity for the people in the community to create housing stability.
Sorry, I'm going to talk about something and a coalition that we had a few years ago. Some of you may be familiar and some may not be. We were actually called the Coalition for the Improvement of Bedford-Stuyvesant, CIBS, and it actually restoration was our base. This was under Councilmember Albert Van. And what we did was we got together with 27 groups in the community. We were a coalition and we all had our specialties and our, we were gurus in certain areas. What we did was we canvassed the community and we spoke to folks and empowered them. And that in turn made them get more interested in, say, listen, what can we find out about? What is it that's in the community that we need to really address and really bring and try to get legislation for? I think something like that needs to happen again, because they are very, the organizations in Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, Central Brooklyn, they're very influential. And if we could do that again to some degree and start that up again, I think that would at least not, control racism or unemployment, whatever, but we could at least get the juices flowing with our community and let them realize, listen, these groups are very serious. We're here to help you, work with us. We're volunteers. We're not paid for this. And it's something that we did for years, and it did a great deal of success in Central Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy specifically, especially with the Aging Improvement District. There's just a lot of good things that were done. And I think something like that could happen again, and including legal organizations like mine, Restoration, other businesses that can, really encompass the entire community. Something like that, again, I think would be a great thing. And we have leeway to the politicians, so I think that's something we could maybe talk about at some other point. Blondell and I can sit down and talk about that at Restoration, but I would certainly like to see something like that again.
Give you more work.
I know. That's okay. I'll take it. Well, it's interesting because I was doing some history and just looking back at some of the things that we did. And Rebekah, you talked about programs that's putting people to work. I think in the 60s and 70s, Restoration had this home improvement program. And what it did, it went to block associations, and the focus was to improve the facades of the brownstones and improve middle-class housing. So it employed local residents. And by the end of the program, 1969, they had renovated 1,400 brownstones over 35 blocks, and they've employed and trained 2,200 residents. 2,200 residents. So, it seems like that is, so that's really impressive. And I think it's some movement like that needs to happen today, where you can get the residents of the community to be part of building something. So it's more of a movement to say, we want to take back our communities, and we want to work and be part of that. So you're also training as well, and teaching, as well as allowing them to do work on the ground to improve their community in some way, shape, or form. And is this legislative? It may be, and it should be, and we should think about that. There are a lot of programs that we have for low income, but the cost of home ownership in New York City is so high. And when you are middle and moderate income, you're left out of so many of these programs. And it's impossible for you to participate and be part of the home ownership discussion, but you still need assistance in a high cost market like New York City.
I see that very issue, and with my work at Pratt Center around energy efficiency, just in that one microcosm, is like, if you're over 80% AMI, like there's nothing for you. 80% AMI, what is that? That's like, you know, like that's not nearly enough to be not helping people. So yeah, it is unfortunate that so many of, you know, even when we think that we found some solution, right, to a problem, when it's implemented, it's, you know, I think policymakers tend to stick to these sort of like rigid outlines instead of being able to get competing for the same grants because they're so limited, right? Or may have like a very different perspective on how they want to solve the problem. I mean, do you feel, it sounds like, you know, with something like CIBS, there really is this opportunity to bring people together and find that. What do you think are some of the sort of things that need to happen to enable sort of more of this coming together?
Okay, so if I look back on how we did it, right, back in the day. So everybody pretty much has a common interest in the community. And I'm gonna use foreclosure as an example. So years ago, we had, you know, a few organizations, everybody fighting for the same funding, but for one cause. Unfortunately, foreclosure has become so large now, there are not enough of us, right? So when it comes to other issues, I think what should happen, the organizations need to come together, and I can assure you that 97% of the issues that we have, they all have. So right there, we know there's a commonality. The second thing is everybody has to be responsible for something. Right? Not one or two people in the coalition that are doing things that everybody else just kind of hangs around. No, everybody needs to be tasked with something, whatever, if it's in their, you know, best interest or whatever. And there needs to be open communication consistently. And in addition to that, there's got to be work, and work has to be done, and people have to show that they're willing to do the work. And if you're not, then you shouldn't be there. So I think if you go into it that way, I can assure you that groups will, you know, say, sure, let's do this. And again, this is the way we kind of did it when we started back over however many years ago. This is how we did it. And again, it was spearheaded by one group, Bed-Stuy Restoration, Coven, and everybody, he got us all together, and we sat down and we said, okay, let's talk about all the issues that we're all having. And I'm not kidding you, 80% of us had the same issue. So that was a tune right there. So now, to fast forward, that can be replicated easily. There are unfortunately more issues now than we had then, so it's an easier, you know, buy-in for everyone. But I think it is doable, and I think, you know, people would be definitely benefiting from it. And again, if there needs to be somebody or some group or one or two folks to get it started, I'm there, you know. So I'm never afraid of work. So I definitely think it could be done again. Most definitely. In Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, Central Brooklyn.
I think I'm being voluntold.
Jacob, could you speak a bit about how, or actually, I just realized we only have 10 minutes left. So I just want to put it out there that if anybody in the audience has questions, like please put them into the chat. Love to have, you know, any questions that are coming up for you. Love to hear them. But in the meantime, while we're waiting, Jacob, maybe could you talk about what collaboration with groups on the ground looks like for you? And then also just like across like different issue areas within the academic world.
Yeah, it's another really good question, and certainly a challenge. You know, academia is unfortunately not constructed to really work directly with community organizations. That's, you know, despite the, you know, desire of many of us to do so, it's not, you know, what people are rewarded for in academia, And so there's a hesitancy among a lot of groups, a lot of academics to do it, especially before tenure. But just to kind of step back, and I was struck, Rebekah, by a part of your kind of framing of the question is like this issue of competition. And I think that this also kind of links back to the earlier points that folks were making about kind of social safety net programs broadly kind of having these strict cutoffs. And like all of us in all of these different realms are unfortunately but intentionally kind of acting from a place of scarcity, right? Where, before going into the academy, I was working at a policy advocacy organization, and like we felt like we were kind of racing with similar groups to get foundation money, and it's really hard to make big change, as you said, kind of as one organization, and then especially when you are forced to compete with other organizations for financial support. And again, the same dynamic is there when we talk about public programs to help people around housing costs, or Rebekah, as you said, kind of investing in green energy. We are arguably the wealthiest country in the history of humanity, and we are kind of compelling low and moderate income households to really kind of battle with each other for what are ultimately kind of scraps of the federal government, especially compared to the largest housing program that the federal government has, which is the home mortgage interest tax deduction, which overwhelmingly benefits very wealthy people and is way larger in scale than every single affordable housing program combined.
So one of the things I'm hearing is that when everybody gets around the table, we need to have some philanthropists there too, with at least some money if we can't get it somewhere else, right? I know that sometimes that I think there has been conversation in the field of where is money sent, right? Or where they choose to fund. But yeah, it's definitely unfortunate, right, that it is the scarcity mindset, because there should be enough to go around for everybody, but then it wouldn't be capitalism, I suppose. So
right.
We have a few minutes left, and I realized one thing that we haven't talked about at all, and I would love to just throw it out there, is really just like how can tenants and homeowners and work together around this, and where I know there's a lot of tension. It's hard to find issue areas where they're in alignment, right? But I would say a lot of tenants don't want to see the neighborhood change, and a lot of homeowners don't want to see the neighborhood change. And so I don't know if models say, like Allison, maybe there's something within the community land trust model that helps sort of bridge that divide. But would love to hear kind of anyone's thoughts on this.
I would say there is definitely a divide that we have to overcome, where people who are tenants feel as though they have no connection with the homeowner, and the homeowner feels like the tenants don't understand where they're coming from either. But the reality is we need to preserve the homes, and that means tenants and homeowners have to work together to be educated. And the goal too is to help educate tenants to then become homeowners at some point. So that can be part of the community land trust work in terms of the supportive services that can tie to it, the toolkits, the relationship building, and the education piece. But it is really taking time to also do a lot of community visioning work, which is what we try to focus on, so that people feel a sense of connection to each other and to the place, recognizing the history of it, that some of it goes untold, and also the possibilities of what could come if we're working together to build the places and spaces that we need to see in order to increase quality of life. So it's definitely hard, because people are so accustomed now to not getting services, not getting access, that you have to really break down those barriers to build trust, and programming and relationship building is really key to helping to amend some of those issues.
Yes, relationship building, breaking down those barriers, getting people to realize that sort of, I mean, in as I said, in this capitalistic society, right? Like there is a determination to pit each other, like tenants and residents or individuals, right, in general against each other, right? And so it's a big issue to overcome, but it sounds like there's some interesting ways to sort of bring people together, like that community visioning idea.
And I would just say also recognizing that there is a very stark difference between the 1 to 4 family homeowner and the large, apartment building landlord. And sometimes our legislation does not recognize that there's a vast difference between those two things as well.
Right. And many within our community, they're that 1 to 4, so they're very reliant on the rents that they're getting from those tenants to support their journey in home ownership from a mortgage standpoint, as well as from a reserves and just upkeep of the home. And one missed payment could tilt the whole, economy of home ownership for those homeowners.
I feel like there is.
Yeah, I think it's. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jacob.
I was just going to build on that and just kind of come back to Blondell, an earlier point that you raised around the way that kind of economic precarity in these households kind of reverberates community-wide. And to me, it really, screams that we need to find additional ways for people and communities to build wealth that is not directly tied to property, because on average, homeowners want home values to go up and renters want home values to go down. And so they're in conflict. And, that's a like deliberate choice that we made as a country around 100 years ago, was to make home ownership the primary tool for wealth accumulation. And it spawned, segregation and the racial wealth gap, et cetera, as well as this conflict between neighbors whose interests should be aligned, because on the vast majority of issues they are, but when it comes to rent or the mortgage, there's a direct financial conflict between those groups.
Yeah.
I would say this is where like maybe a community REIT could help to stem that tide and bridge that gap, because then you get buy-in from community about, homeownership. It can be targeted to, restoration of places where Blacks historically have lost homes. And you can do that, build that model across the nation and privilege and value those homes and generate income as well that way, so that people can still have a way to earn money and also keep homes.
On that note, we have 26 seconds left. And for each panelist, what's one thing that gives you hope? Allison, we'll start with you.
I think seeing all these other people who are here in this fight that have been here and are still going to stick it out. So that gives me inspiration.
Excellent. Richard.
I actually didn't hear what you said, your question.
I said, what gives you hope? Oh no, the time is up.
My client. Our clients give me hope.
Excellent. Blondell and Jacob, one word, and then we're gonna end this conversation. One thing that gives you hope?
Strategic partnership.
All right.
The Black Lives Matter movement.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. This has been really enjoyable, learning so much from you guys. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the center for putting this together.
Good to see everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, for expanding and amplifying our conversation about Brooklyn challenges and specific solutions. Now we're going to take 20 minutes to explore the work of some of our various programs and partners, including the Homeowner Hub, my home at the center. I can't wait for everyone to get a glimpse of what else is being done to uplift affordable homeownership. To join, click on the agenda page and click Join Info Session. I'll see you right there.